think vulnerability is a superpower, is the best way that I can describe it. Because when you are vulnerable is when you can best be like, when you're vulnerable is when the most change occurs. It's when you're, and not even just change, it's also when you experience the most love. Like in a sexual space, if you're deeply vulnerable with your partner, that's going to be the most connected sex that you have, versus one where it's like brain shut down, only physical, right? Like this ability to open yourself up and allow yourself to be impacted is so scary. There's a comment as a rapper that he says, "I want to be the one to make you happiest and hurt you the most." And that's not a thing saying he wants to hurt his partner. It's a commentary on when you are trying to love someone deeply, you are opening yourself up to this deep vulnerability.
Today, my guest is Dylan Weisman. Dylan is a high-stakes poker professional who counts amongst his prized possessions 2 World Series of Poker bracelets. He is also a world-renowned poker coach, but the reason I got him on the podcast today is the work he does with high-performing humans as a high-performance coach. Today, Dylan and I talk about the mental and emotional barriers that high performers encounter. We talk about communication frameworks. We talk about conflict resolution strategies. We talk about vulnerability, and we talk about dealing with changes in friendship groups when we transition through the video game of conscious living. So without further ado, I'll shut the hell up and leave you in the capable hands of the one and the only Dylan Weisman. Straight into it, what are some of the common mental and emotional barriers that you're seeing in your clients on a day-to-day basis?
It's a very good question. I think that when I think about the barriers that my clients have, a lot of it just has to do with whatever their leaks are as individuals. And so the main thing that I'll see specifically in my high performing like startup people and even like the high stakes poker people would be emotional dysregulation and kind of how subtle that can be relative to what the expectations are. So a lot of people, when they think of emotional dysregulation, they think of panic attacks or they think of deep depression. But in reality, a lot of what happens, like to dysregulate just means that you yourself are not calibrating as your day goes on. And so, but if you have a conversation that you need to have with somebody, maybe you can't bring an empathetic viewpoint to it because your body is a little antsy. And so it doesn't show up as a blow up. It shows up as unempathetic communication that's not as efficient. Or if you are unable to problem solve effectively because you're getting frustrated or you're getting overwhelmed, that itself is emotional dysregulation. And because a lot of what happens with high-level humans in terms of the problem-solving component is that they're neurodivergent. Not everybody, but there's a lot of neurodivergence that shows up, especially in the poker world. And one of the main corollaries to that is emotional dysregulation. And so I'd say that is one of the biggest hurdles because it's so personal. Like you have to do a lot of your own self-work, either in therapy or with like a sports psychologist, depending on what you're trying to optimize for. But if you don't do that work yourself, it's so hard to catch these things because they're so subtle.
You mentioned there not calibrating as the day goes by, and that really speaks to me. Mm-hmm. My audience are people suffering from alcohol reliance. And what will happen is throughout the day, everything's going okay. And then boom, something happens and I need a drink. And you've hit the nail on the head. It's about that calibration or the recalibration throughout the day and having that self-awareness. Talk a little bit more about that.
I actually love that comparison because it just speaks to the addiction frameworks that the human body runs through. And a lot like, For me, like I have a stimulus, like I have ADHD. And so I literally am dopamine seeking constantly. And so if it'll get to the middle of the day, I'll be trying to calm down and my brain will want to go look at a screen or it'll want to play online. It'll want to play online poker. That's what I did as a kid to like get my fix for my stimulus addiction. I just got addicted to online poker, but it was an addiction. I was literally feeding my dopamine feedback loops with online poker. And that built some very unhealthy pathways, right? And so the thing that I've worked on the most and the thing that I've seen the most success with is first the awareness component in terms of what your cycles are, right? And so if you're somebody who's working a 9 to 5, for example, where your days are relatively consistent, it'll usually be true relative to those days when you'll start to get those cravings, right? And the same that you're speaking with alcohol. For me, it's speaking for stimulus. Other people, it's caffeine, right? But once you know your patternings, you can start to account for your own patternings. And this is something, sorry, drink water. Ah, perfect. This is something you actually see at the high stakes of poker players, for example, like when you go to the Tritons, is that people are aware of like, tournament starts at 3. And then I need to drink caffeine at this time, eat at this time, because I know that my body will go through these cycles very specifically. And so if you have an awareness of what your average cycling is, then you can start to build infrastructure to mitigate the impact of these cravings that happen, right? And I think it particularly is important in knowing what your own language for those cravings are. I can't speak to alcoholism because my body is pretty much allergic to alcohol, but I do know that in the like addiction feedback loops that I've had, they're not really like big. They're very subtle in the same way I was describing before. So it's not like, oh, I need to go slam an online poker session right now. It's, oh, I'm going to take out my phone and get a hit of dopamine that way, right? And I can tell that's usually around like the 2 to 3 o'clock time for me. From like 2 to 5 is when my brain starts to get a little funky. And then from 5 onwards, I'll usually be good for the rest of the night. So just being aware of what your cycling is allows you to create systems to mitigate what you're trying to mitigate against.
I'll give you an example of that for the audience, actually, to piece it together, and then I'll ask you to share your thoughts on self-awareness. A good example of what you're talking about there for me is low blood sugar. Like I'm hypothyroid, and as I'm getting older, I'm noticing. Well, maybe it's because I'm getting older, or maybe it's because I'm feeling in the body a lot more than I used to when I was younger. I don't know which it is. Probably a combination of both. But if I don't eat the right things, particularly in the afternoon, I get really low blood sugar. And if I go back to the days when I was alcohol reliant, it would be a huge problem for me. So I would have to be really aware that, Lee, if you do not eat right around this time, I'm going to have a problem and I may drink alcohol. So for those of you at home thinking, how does this apply to me from alcohol, for example, that's an example of something that could be really subtle, but it's you like a sledgehammer when you've got more experience of being in the body and feeling in the body, if that makes sense. But in order to do that, you need to raise your self-awareness. How do you raise your self-awareness, Dylan?
That's a deep question, and one that I'm still working on. And I think I'll be working on for my entire life. It really depends on the person for that one. For me, a lot of the self-awareness journey has come from a combination of places. I think that the first place that it came from was through friends and family. So having people that were cognizant and aware enough to kind of help me in bringing forth like, hey, this doesn't seem like a good pattern. The next one was just like, I've done heaps of therapy, like heaps and heaps and heaps of therapy, where I have a personal therapist for like myself. I have a sports psychologist that's designed for the poker stuff and high performance, and then a couples therapist for my partner and I. And I think that each of those different types of therapies built a different layer of self-awareness into me. For example, in the couples therapy, a lot of what the work that we've done over the last half decade is communication infrastructure building. So how do my partner and I build a communication framework that allow us to tackle any problem, right? And that brought me an awareness of just how I communicate to myself. Because if I'm communicating to my partner in this way, I'm probably also talking to myself in this way too, right? So that was one layer there. I can go. I'm not going to expound on this because I could go for a very long time on the different types of awarenesses that come from the different therapies. That one is really powerful, though, in my opinion, especially if you have a human that resonates with you. Like if you have a therapist that like therapy really feels like dating to me. If it doesn't feel good, find somebody else. Like it should be I'm going to use strong terminology. It should be a fuck yes with your therapist, in the same way like dating your spouse should feel that same way too. I also pretty big on the breathwork meditation thing, just because it doesn't necessarily give you deep introspection into your psyche, and or it doesn't have to, it can at some of the higher levels of when you're doing meditation. And I think that it does bring an awareness, just like being in your body and being present in the moment. And to me, that is one of the most acute tools to kind of impact your days. Because if you're practicing awareness of being in your moment, and then you can tell that that's not happening at that time, it's so easy to bring yourself back. Like if you want to be present in the space and your brain is off, like in the case of alcohol, like if you're sitting in your present moment and breathing, you're probably not thinking as much of like a craving for an alcohol dependency, because also your probability of being anxious or dysregulated goes down too, right? Just from a physiological perspective. But the capacity to know where you're sitting in that moment in time is such a powerful tool for allowing yourself to navigate each of those moments as they come by.
Do you have any examples for the people listening of communication frameworks that have actually been really successful for you and your partner?
Yeah. I have a bunch. The first one is nonviolent communication, really easy one, where there's a book, super standard. But like what we've been using this one recently, just for context, my partner and I are buying a house and getting married within the next we actually buy, like our house closes in 2 days and we're getting married in 3 weeks. And so this has been one of the more stressful time periods that we've had, just because of the sheer amount of things that need to get done to accomplish both of those. And so we've been employing a really consistent nonviolent communication structure, just because we've had so much stress going on, right? And that's, I think, when communication frameworks are the most important, is when both people are low bandwidth. And when both people are low bandwidth, they both have an awareness that they just don't have as many resources to bring to conflict resolution. And so having a communication methodology like nonviolent communication, which pretty much just means like you say, I'm feeling this way, and you don't say like, I'm feeling pissed off at you. You say, I'm feeling frustrated, or like you communicate your emotion that you're having in that moment. And then, well, you first say what is happening here. So like you acknowledge like, this thing that's happening makes me feel this way, and this is my ask from this. And so you remove the you language, because that tends to be very combatatory. It's like, you're doing this to me, or like you make me do this, or all this shit's happening is making me do this. And when you remove the pointedness in a partner communication, it becomes less about me versus you, but us against the problem. And I think that is, I'd say, the main foundation for a lot of these communication infrastructures. It's like, how do you remove it from me versus you to us versus the problem? So I think that's the first one that I would just say that's really easy to look up and like read a book on, that I'd highly recommend for most humans. The next one that we do is, and this is more of a deep cut, but it's when one of us is like, when we're both really dysregulated, when we're not seeing eye to eye, we will do an exercise where one person will sit and listen, and the other person will just say everything that they're feeling. And just communicate their entire experience. And the job of the person communicating their experience is to really try to be heard. Like, because a lot of what happens in conflict in any relationship, whether it be romantic or friendship, is that, well, one person doesn't feel heard. Therefore, they are not going to be stoked on that, on having the other person either be ignorant or not treating them appropriately, right? So it's the job of the person communicating to really like say what they're feeling. And it's the job of the other person to listen and to repeat it back in a way where the person who's communicating actually can feel heard. So if I'm mad at you and I'm saying a bunch of things, and you're listening to me as I say something, like if I say, I'm really upset because you said you were going to do these things and you didn't do these things, I'd repeat back to you, what I'm hearing right now is that my inability to execute on the things that I'm doing is frustrating for you. And then you can either acknowledge it, or you can say, yes, and also this stuff. And you literally do that until one person has nothing else to say. So that can, like, everything. And then you switch, and the other person holds space for that person. And that one is that's more of the, like, when you're deep in the trenches, having a tougher conversation, but it is so incredibly powerful and really hard to do because you're usually tilted at each other. Right. And so one person's got to bite the bullet and listen being super tilted to the like while the other person is communicating all the things that they're tilted about. But there's power in that. And there's power in seeing your partner, even though you know they're tilted, sitting and listening to you. I love that one a lot. It's one that takes a lot of practice. Like you can't, like if you get it right the first time, I would be shocked. It took us like many months to get good at it, but we've used it recently in a conflict, and it's really powerful. So those two things, which I as I said, they're less about the I and more about us really trying to be heard and be seen and work through a problem. Those are two, and also timeouts. I don't know if you use these ones, but one of the big things is when we become tilted, our prefrontal cortex is shutting down, and so our capacity to actually have a good conversation is not there. And so we have an agreement in our partnership where you can call a timeout at any time, literally. Like if you're in the middle of a conversation and you're getting tilted, or you sense them getting tilted, you say, hey, I need a timeout. The other person has to honor that, but you have to say, okay, I'm taking this much time and then I'm coming back. Because the other person's tilted, right? So you can't just say I'm leaving and I'm not coming back. You have to give a container. It's like, I'll be gone for 30 minutes. I'm going to go take a walk with the dog, and then we'll come back and then try again. And if you try again and you're still tilted, you take another timeout until the bodies are no longer cortisol dumping into each other. But yeah, those are a couple good ones.
Oh, thank you for that. For people at home who are not used to poker parlance, tilted is you losing emotional control or losing your shit.
Exactly. It doesn't feel good. It does not feel good to be tilted.
A couple of things on that, just to accentuate your points. With the nonviolent communication, something that I've noticed a lot with my clients lately, there seems to be a pattern. And usually when there's a pattern in my clients, it's something that I have to look at myself. So, but this has been going on where, the evaluations versus observations. So what Rosenberg says is, first of all, you have to say, you have to repeat back to the person what actually happened, but it actually has to be that thing, right? It's almost like I use this example when I'm coaching people. Imagine your partner comes to you, wants to give you a kiss, sits next to you on the couch, wants to give you a kiss, and they move away you got to give them a kiss, and they move away from you. Mm-hmm. An observation would be, hey, when I sat down to give you a kiss and you moved away from me, that's an observation because that's exactly what happened. Whereas an evaluation would be, when I come and sat next to you and I went to give you a kiss and you moved away because you were angry, right?
Exactly.
Evaluation. So I've been trying to help people really narrow in on that, because what I'm getting a lot with my clients still, and I don't know if you find this, is I think. So what's happening is they're creating stories, right? I think this about my husband. I think my husband thinks this. I think my husband feels this. I think my wife. And I'm like, okay, we're dealing in evaluations here, right? Go and find out if that's true. And people are like, what? I can't ask, you know what I mean? Like I can't go and ask them if my story is true. And I found with my wife that if I go to my wife and say, hey, I've created this story in my head that when you said X,
those are the words.
I feel it. I think that it means Y. Can you let me know if I'm fucking way off point here? Mm-hmm. Or so I can forget my story and move on? Or are you trying? Is there something to this that I need to hear? Right? I think that's very powerful. I don't know if you want to comment on that at all.
Oh, we use that a lot. The story in my head is the communication tool there. It's like the story in my head right now is that this is happening. It's like the story in my head is that you're angry at me, or the story in my head is that you don't want to hang out with me, right? And so when you preface it that way, I think the main reason why that is so powerful is because it removes the urge for the person hearing that information to go on the defensive, right? Because let's say in your example, the spouse is sitting on the couch, you went to kiss them, they moved away, and they were literally just like doing a side stretch, right? In that moment. But then you say, well, you were moving away because you didn't want to kiss me. And then they get on the defensive. Like that's the initial response pattern. And so the intention with the story in my head vocabulary, and I'm trying to remember where I learned that one. That one is maybe a Brene Brown. I don't remember. But it's so powerful in that it removes the blaming language, the you language, and it brings it back to the individual. Like, this is my experience right now. can we talk about it? And so a lot of the times the next step for that, for the person hearing it, they say, okay, where does that come from? Like, I'd love to get a better understanding of why you feel that way. Because a lot of the times where the person is communicating the story in their head, it's not just about the story that's happening. It's about why that story is happening. Like, where did that come from? And so if I have bandwidth, I'll ask about it. And if I don't have bandwidth, then I'll be like, hey, that's a really hard story. I'm sorry that you're feeling that way. I'd love to talk about it when I have more energy to right now. Because you can't always show up in moments where a person's having an emotional experience. Like if you're working and your partner's anxious and you don't have the capacity to meet their needs in that time, what you can do is say, your needs are valid. I see them and I'd love to meet them, just not in this moment. And that's, I think, another really powerful thing to remove the stigma on communicating emotion. That's something that was one of my leaks for a long time. It was like my partner would come to me, she'd say that she was feeling something, and I would feel a need to accommodate for it in that moment, which actually isn't good because that means I'm not paying attention to my personal space and I'm just hurting both of us because I can't meet them in that moment. I'm not setting effective boundaries. And so by having the non-blaming vocabulary, as long as the two of you kind of have some scripts in place where both people can either set effective boundaries or get their needs met, that type of communication feels a lot smoother.
Yeah, what you're talking about there, bang on. It's like boundaries, right? I mean, when I grew up in a boundaryless household.
That's hard.
It wasn't until I was in my 40s, actually, even though I'd done a heap of work, that my wife really got me to understand boundaries, especially emotional dumping. And I have a lot of poker players who are clients, and this is one as well, where it's like they'll finish the session and then they'll go and spew off their bad beats and their misery and their pain and suffering from poker to their partner, who has, not interested in it, right? And trying to help them to see that, like, you're emotionally dumping on them, and like, so there's a boundary into, like, it's okay if the other person is all right with that, but you got to ask permission, right? I mean, that's another thing it was fairly new to me, was like asking permission around things. Asking permission to kiss my daughter. Now, people might think that's insane, but until you ask your daughter, she's 8, and I say, Zia, can I give you a kiss? And she says no, and she says no a lot. You realize, actually, how many times am I breaching a boundary here? Because she says no a lot, and I guess not taking it personally. What's your thoughts on not taking it personally, Dylan?
You talked about you brought up something that is probably one of my main, I don't want to use the word areas of study because it's not like I'm doing it academically, but it's just consent frameworks is what you're talking about right now. And I've spent an immense amount of time in the consent framework space because I do partner acrobatics as a hobby, dance as a hobby. My partner and I are polyamorous. And so the consent space is just so vast. And so your question, it's like not taking things personally, that truly is just that to me is like the secondary order question. Because the first order question is, how are you showing up in spaces and asking for consent for things? Like, so let's say that you go to a swing dance and go ask someone to dance. It's like, hey, would you like to dance? They say no. And you say, oh, thank you. That's awesome. Thank you for saying no. Right. Instead of pushing their no, thanking them for setting a boundary is so much healthier, because then it creates a safe space for people to set their boundaries, right? And what's really challenging, particularly for men, is that they hear no so much, and so there's this intense ego-driven thing where they say, you're saying no because of this reason. You're saying no. And a lot of the male stuff gets very toxic, especially if you look on the internet for like women setting their boundaries around men. It's a really intense space. And I get it from a male perspective, because they're making bids for connection. That's what this is, right? Like, you're bidding for connection to people and you're not receiving positive bids. It's really hard to be rejected all the time. It becomes very internal. A lot of the times the reason why that bid is rejected is because the way that you're bidding is just bad. Like your bidding system is not efficient. And so if you show up to a space and create an invitation without expectations, and I think that that's one of the most powerful ways to frame a bid for connection or a consent thing. It's like, hey, I would love to invite you to do this, and there's no expectation of you on the other side. That releases the other person to actually say yes a lot more often. Because if they feel as if it's an expectation, then their body's going to tense up. It's not going to feel good for anybody. And the probability of getting the no goes up by a lot. But if you genuinely are just creating an invitation and don't expect them to say yes on the other side, it is like, one, your probability of success is going to go up empirically. And then two, when it doesn't happen, you're okay with that and they're okay with that. And it increases the probability for those bids of connection to be supported over time. And this is less in like a pickup space, more in a partnership space, right? Like you want to hang out with your partner and like I'm sure a lot of people have had partners, and I know this is a poker player thing. I hear it all the time with my clients too. It's like they have a partner that wants their bandwidth and they want to go play poker, right? Or they have things to do. And so their partner is bidding for connection and they are not receiving it well because they feel like it's an expectation. Right. And so if you can reframe it from the partner's perspective, be like, hey, I'd love to spend some time with you. If right now isn't good, let me know a time that is good because I do need this. But I don't expect this from you in this moment right now. I'm just letting you know a need that I have. And so for us to work together on it. Right. And so it really ties into this like deep consent framework that is not trivial and has to be taught because it's not taught to us as a society. Like consent is not in our cultural consciousness on the mass scale. It is in a lot of pockets. And in like my personal communities, everyone knows a consent vocabulary, but I'd say that it's particularly not true in like the poker community, for example. There's really not a lot of that idea in there, especially when it comes to like you were describing people doing emotional labor, right? Holding space for somebody, like holding space for a bad beat story. How many people walk up to you and say, hey, let me tell you this bad beat story? I just say no often. And that's been for me more important in the last couple of years as because I'm a very prominent coach in the poker space. And so people all the time want to ask me for like hands or to hold space. And like literally when I walk around WSOP, I get walked up to at a very high frequency. And so one of my biggest learning journeys has been setting emotional boundaries and actually just saying no more often. Be like when I need to. I won't all the time. And I want people to come say hi. But if I'm like tired and you want to ask me about a poker hand, I'm just going to say, I have to set a boundary and say no.
I interrupt this conversation with Dylan Weisman to bring you a wonderful opportunity. If you are somebody who is alcohol-free as fuck and you really want to live a self-led life, then maybe the Strive Method Workshop is for you. It is a 6-month experience where you can learn to live more consciously, alcohol-free as fuck. Usually when people stop drinking alcohol, they find it really difficult to transition back into life. So I am here to provide you with the support framework and the community to help you smash this goal. So if you want to live a self-led life, email me at thestrivemethod@gmail.com or WhatsApp me on +44 753 789 6829 and I will give you more details. Now back to Dylan Weisman. There's so much self-reflection and self-awareness and gold in saying no. You know, yesterday I was at the farmer's market and my dearest friend was bending my ear and trying to get me to spend some time and energy invested in a business project he's got. And he was so polite and he was so beautiful and it seemed really great and amazing. And he said, I'll send you the TEDx talk of this guy and you can watch it. And I think a couple of years ago, I probably would have said, yeah, okay, yeah, send it along. This sounds amazing. I'll get involved. But yesterday I said, look, guy, I love you, man. And this sounds really great for you. But if you send me a TEDx talk right now, I ain't going to watch it. And if you want me to get involved in this thing, it's just going to go on a list of things that I ain't going to do because it ain't a priority for me. So, you know, I'm just going to be upfront with you right now. But I have to tell you, it was uncomfortable for me to say that to him because my modus operandi, and this used to be a problem for me in poker, still shows up every now and then, is the need for approval. So, you know, you talked about the invitation and the expectation. I would go up to high stakes poker players, as you know, because I'm in Triton, and ask people for interviews with the expectation that they would say yes. And when they would say no, I would activate my inner child. I would respond in a gnarly way if the no was also gnarly. Right? What I've learned today is to, one, drop the expectation, and two, try to find love and compassion and empathy for the gnarly no. Yeah. Because that means that the other person, I see the gnarly no as a part of that person trying to keep them safe somehow. So because I see it from that safety mechanism, that piece of love, I don't need that need for approval anymore. But that's only been in the last couple of years. Like I've upset a lot of high stakes poker players in the past, I'm sure, but the way that my inner child has come up and has responded to those things, you know?
Yeah, you're asking a lot of neurodivergent poker players playing for a ton of money to use their bandwidth to talk to them. It's like it's not trivial. It's hard. Like, especially Triton, that environment is so intense. It's fun. It's really fun, and it's funny seeing. Like, I know that this is maybe not your target audience, but it's very interesting just seeing the. How do I describe it? It's kind of like the caveman-esque ecosystem that shows up, because it's such a competition for resources, because you're playing, it's so competitive. And so you have people that have their little cliques that work with each other, that have their own routines, right? And a lot of those humans, you know, they could have just lost 7 figures very quickly, like within 2 days, because that's how big the stakes are, right? And so it makes a lot of sense why it would be hard for them to set boundaries with kindness, because they're just trying to set a boundary because they're like, yo, dude, I don't have it right now. Right. Where the other, there are other humans there that I think are less tuned into the swings, less tuned, like more comfortable. Like if you talk to a Stephen Chidwick at this point of his life, right, you can really feel how grounded he is and all the work that he's been doing. But that's going to feel different than a lot of other poker players in that space. And so you have to know your audience, and that's a tough one, especially when there's so much, when it's such an intense environment, and a lot of them probably just aren't used to talking to people. Like that's just not how they grew up. They grew up, you know, grinding online poker for 12 hours a day to get to the place that they did.
Yeah, and you know, when you pointed out then that this is not our target audience, because you know the target audience here are people who want to overcome alcohol reliance and live a self-led life, it still matters, because what we're talking about here is, it's almost like it's not about them, right? Like it's about you, like it's about me. So like when I'm getting feedback from whoever, in this case high stakes poker players, that is causing me to become dysregulated, then I have to learn to create the question in my foundation, or my GTO way of living, is what is this situation reflecting back at me that I need to learn and I need to focus on and I need to get with here. So it doesn't matter if they're high stakes poker players, crypto investors, your mom, some unconscious doctor or barista in Starbucks. If you want to live a self-led life, for me anyway, like you want to live more consciously, it's about taking responsibility, 100% responsibility for the way you respond to other people, not trying to get other people to change, because that's like playing the outside-in game, right?
Yeah, no, you said something in there. I'm fully on board with everything you just said. I want to pick a piece out of it, which is where you said GTO life. And what I love about GTO, shout out to Joe Ingram, is that it has become such a part of the nomenclature for poker. And this is actually, so for those who are unaware, GTO means game theory optimal. And that's actually a mathematical construct that we're talking about here. And it means that there's something called a Nash equilibrium in any sort of a game. And what that Nash equilibrium states is that in this game, if you play a certain strategy, it does not matter what your opponent does. Your strategy cannot lose. That does not mean that your strategy will win the most. Those are different ideas. It just means that in practice, your strategy cannot be beaten. And so when we kind of use GTO flippantly a little bit, but I actually do think that, and this is something that, going back to the communication things, that there are GTO frameworks for communication, in that you can build a communication methodology that no matter who you're talking to, on average, it won't lose. Like you can talk to a stark Republican or a vehement liberal, and no matter who they are or what their traumas are, there are communication modalities that will allow you to meet that person where they are. And that is something that is incredibly challenging. Our couples therapist, Dr. Liz Powell, absolute savage at this. They are incredibly, incredibly good at building these kind of GTO frameworks. It's what my partner and I have based our communication frameworks on. But I kind of want to just pick at that, because like we say GTO lifestyle, and I do think it's impossible to live an optimal, perfect life, no matter how dialed you are. We're human beings. We're weird, squishy creatures that have emotions. And yes, there is the idea of enlightenment, and I'm not going to say that doesn't exist either. For those of us who are not enlightened Buddhas on this planet, I think that there are more approachable ways to kind of build that GTO lifestyle, one of which is the communication ideas. And so I'm happy that you asked it earlier in this conversation, because all the ones that I mentioned to me are part of that kind of GTO communication infrastructure, right? If your communication is nonviolent, then by definition, you're not triggering something in the other human. And maybe like if they don't have a self-awareness on what's going on, it could confuse them, for example. But when you get really good at it, it doesn't feel like you're doing a thing, like you're doing a tactic. It just feels like you're talking to somebody. And that's what takes the practice to have it feel more fluid.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, for me, the GTO of life is like, for me, it's like, it's almost like I'm an AI, right? And I have a motherboard, and I need to program this motherboard, the foundations of how it's going to respond or react, and then to deviate away from those moments. I remember David Burns, the author of Feeling Good. He's been on the podcast a couple of times. He's a cognitive behavioral therapist wizard. Like he's the Gandalf of CBT, right?
That's cool.
And he actually recorded a therapy session with me, which he released in 3 episodes on his podcast. And he was teaching me how to take 100% responsibility, right? How to kill my ego in conflict with my wife. And he did this therapy session for 3 hours. I had a mind-blown moment. Tears flowed, and I thought I was quote unquote cured. And then a couple of months later, me and Liza are walking through Barcelona, and we have this massive meltdown. And I called David. I'm like, it doesn't work. And he said, Lee, the death of the ego is the loneliest road. Are you taking 100% responsibility for your part in this conflict that just happened? And I'm like, no. And he's like, do you want to? I'm like, no. And he's like, well, if you don't want to, then you're going to keep getting the results. But the point is, if I just learned to just implement the strategy, in this case, NVC, or in David's, the 5 secrets of effective communication, do it wrong, slip out of integrity. Maybe I get dysregulated and I don't do it right and I lose my temper, my inner child comes up, but then get back into integrity by going back and have effective rupture repair. If I do that all the time, it cannot lose. Like if I am a robot and I just do NVC all the time, I cannot lose. I cannot upset anyone. I can't, well, I mean, it's not through my issue if they get upset, but it's like you say, it's non-violent communication. It says it on the tin, right? So yeah. I find particularly with people who are suffering from alcohol reliance, they need these frameworks. They need something in their life that they can just practice until they get a little bit better at it, because it helps develop that self-awareness and that confidence and that hope and that trust. You know what I mean? Like super important, I think.
No, 100%. I really strongly resonate with everything that you just said. You made a small reference to shoot. Do you know? Are you aware of the shooting of the second arrow? Does that idea?
I don't know that metaphor, but tell the audience about it.
Yeah, so it's pretty much where you make a mistake, and then you get tilted at yourself for making that mistake.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So there's a first arrow that got shot, and then you shoot the second arrow into yourself, right? And or like you get shot with an arrow, and then you shoot the second arrow into yourself. And what's really hard with, and I know this is very true for people with addiction. I've had my own addiction episodes at different stages of my life, mostly when I was younger, just out of lack of awareness. And this feeling of making a big mistake, like for me, the relapses would come like when I was younger playing poker, I'd like bust a bankroll because I was so dysregulated as a child and didn't know what I was doing. And I would be so angry at myself for days and days and days and days. And it wouldn't fix it. The shooting of the second arrow did not make me not bust those bankrolls more. Then nothing changed. I wasn't actually inputting new data into that feedback loop. I was just punching myself in the face after I'd already been punched in the face. And that this goes into what you've already been speaking to, like the self-love practice, the self-compassion stuff, right? But once you can remove the second arrow as a part of your consciousness, like a part of your self-consciousness, or as a part of your patterning when it comes to conflict, it's such an unblocker for two reasons. The first reason is that you don't spend the bandwidth being mad at yourself. Like you don't use all those emotional resources. And then the second one is that actually creates more space to understand why that first arrow was shot, right? Like that, and that's so hard for people. It's like, why are you relapsing into this thing, right? And if you're mad at yourself for relapsing, then you're not going to figure that out. You're going to just be stuck there because you're angry. And so you don't actually get to sit there and question what happened in this moment. It comes back to the awareness piece that we were speaking of earlier, right? If you're angry at yourself, you're not aware of what happened. All that you're doing is you're creating this obfuscation of the emotions that happened previously by being mad at yourself, which is actually a trauma response pattern, right? You don't get to fix your trauma if you're mad at your trauma for happening, right? You have to actually give it the space to breathe. And that's where the therapy stuff is so powerful. It's like actually figuring out what was going on instead of being upset at yourself for having the thing happen. And I think you mentioned it pretty well in your conversation, in that you were like, well, why did this happen again? I thought it's not supposed to. And then you have this secondary awareness, like, well, I don't want to be perfectly selfless in this moment. I don't want to figure out what only happened to me, right? Or what was my responsibility here? I want it to be my partner's responsibility too. Like I want it to be both. And it kind of shows how if you're not bringing yourself into that moment of what the conflict was and actually evaluating it, whether it be shooting the second arrow or still being in that space, you're not actually going to move through it. Like that patterning is not going to change. There is a really cool study done, and I'm quoting not the study, but I'm quoting a podcast that Brene Brown and Tim Ferriss did, where they were talking about learning mechanisms for children, whether it comes to positive or negative reinforcement, right? And a lot of, like the majority of us, myself not included, which I'm actually very grateful for, got negative reinforcement in terms of what their childhood upbringing was. And in terms of like academics and things like that. It's like, oh, you got a B+ on this thing. That's not good enough, right? And what was shown was that negative reinforcement in the short term would maybe spike results, but in the long term would not actually be a sustainable way to get children to learn and grow. Whereas the neutral to positive reinforcement, because you can't say that a child did a good thing if they did a bad thing, right? You can't say, oh, that was so good that you like kicked sand in Timmy's face. Like that's not what we're trying to do here. But if you can create the like neutral to positive feedback loop, you're just more likely to learn. And that's exactly what the shooting the second arrow is. It's the negative feedback loop within yourself, right? Whereas the positive feedback loop inside yourself is just like self-love and compassion, which is very hard to practice and something that I still am working on and will work on forever, right? But if you can you speak to your inner child parenting that you were already describing, this is that exact same thing, just taking it to a different level.
What came up for me when you was talking about shooting the second arrow there and reflecting back on that fight that I had in Barcelona with Liza, was vulnerability, and how much work I had to do on self-awareness in order for me to be vulnerable. So, for example, when David, Liza would say to me a lot when we were in the early stages of our relationship, you love to fight with me. And whenever she said that, my inner child would be activated, come to defense mode, and it would feel shame. And it would it's just got a shame grenade thrown at it, and it pins out, and it would fucking throw it back at her with like, how fucking stupid can you be to say that? Like, there's no way I like fighting. I love you. I don't want to fight. And what David got me to see in his therapy with me was, holy shit, I have a part of my personality that fucking loves fighting with people, especially those who I love the most, because this part uses violence, aggression to keep me safe. And so that was like super vulnerable for me, because I was able to go back to life and say, hey, you said I really like fighting. You're right. You were right. And I'm really sorry that I didn't recognize that in you. I imagine that made you feel so frustrated, gaslit, annoyed, upset, so like your insanity was gone. I am so sorry. I got that wrong. I'm aware of it now. I'm still probably going to fuck it up, but please draw it to my attention when I do it, because I'm more aware of it right now. Talk a little bit about vulnerability, how it's come into your world, Dylan.
First off, I respect a lot the vulnerability of even communicating about that in a public space, because it is not trivial to show the ways in which you were not at your best, and to do so to your partner, and then to do so in the space of others, is a powerful thing. So props to you for having done enough work to show up and be vulnerable in this moment, talking about a thing that was not your best light, right? Like that's super powerful. Vulnerability I think vulnerability is a superpower, is the best way that I can describe it. Because when you are vulnerable is when you can best be like, when you're vulnerable is when the most change occurs. It's when and not even just change, it's also when you experience the most love. Like in a sexual space, if you're deeply vulnerable with your partner, that's going to be the most connected sex that you have, versus one where it's like brain shut down, only physical, right? Like this ability to open yourself up and allow yourself to be impacted is so scary. There's a Common lyric, Common is a rapper, that he says, I want to be the one to make you happiest and hurt you the most. And that's not a thing saying he wants to hurt his partner. It's a commentary on when you are trying to love someone deeply, you are opening yourself up to this deep vulnerability that allows them to impact you in this way, and allows you to impact them, which is a lot of the times just as scary if you love someone as much as you do your partner, or as much as I do with my partner, you do with yours, I'm going to assume, right? Like that is such there's so much fear and vulnerability. And I think that there's this idea that I really try to have dictate my current life right now, which is that if I am making decisions from a fear space, a lot of the times they are not made in vulnerability. They're made in some sort of response pattern, a defensiveness pattern. But if I'm making decisions based out of a space of love, or out of a space of kindness or empathy, right? If those are what my decisions are being based off of, then one, the probability of success is just astronomically higher on average. And two, I am being vulnerable enough to actually ask for what I want, or to do what my why self is saying to do. And that's a lot of what vulnerability is. It's like tuning into like your deep wisdom and being like, oh, wow, this is a thing. Like I made a mistake here. I blundered this with someone that I love in a deep way. Right. And that's not trivial to do. And you have to really practice being vulnerable. I think that men in our society are not taught to be vulnerable. I had to unlearn so much societal programming around showing emotion and being able to be vulnerable. It's funny. I had my bachelor party last weekend, and my favorite part of it was that it was 12 dudes on a couch cuddling each other. And I loved that so much. No, real talk. It was one of my favorite, like there's a lot of really cool things there, but just the fact that everyone there had done enough work on themselves as a human being, where they could just be vulnerable in a place where society told you that you're like not supposed to do that. Like that was really powerful to me and something that I had a lot of gratitude for. And it showed a lot of the vulnerability of everyone showing up to that space with their friends and being able to do that. And this is a topic that I could probably speak on for a long time, but this probably feels like a good time to stop.
Well, actually, I'm going to encourage you to speak about it a little bit more, because something just came to mind as you were saying that. On Saturday, my wife and my little daughter Zia, we went for a walk and we ended up in a Thai restaurant. And as we're eating, in walks a friend of mine who I hadn't seen in over a decade. And he was a friend who I would say was very close, almost like a brother, right?
Mm-hmm.
And our connection really was alcohol. So he would come over to my house with his wife and his kid. So would a few other guys who all lived around. We would play poker. We would get smashed. Our kids would be on their little Nintendos, like in a room somewhere, like zombies. We were totally incapable of looking after them because we were so smashed, blacked out. And then somehow, by a miracle, nobody died. And he was my best mate at the time. And then when I stopped drinking, I made a conscious decision. I didn't think it would happen, but it did, that I just let them go. And this is the first time I've seen him. So it was really great to connect with him. I loved him. It was good to see him and to catch up and all that kind of stuff. But I left without the intention of ever probably seeing him again. And the reason I'm giving that context, Dylan, in this space of alcohol reliance, so many people make the monumental, brave, courageous, vulnerable decision to be alcohol-free as fuck. And those that are closest to them, because of the cognitive dissonance effect of what I call the liquid lie around how we all become indoctrinated from birth to drink alcohol, like they don't get the respect, they don't get the acknowledgement, they don't get anything from friends and family. And the fear of being alone and being isolated and being ostracized from the tribe often leads to relapse. So I'm always telling people, look, my experience as a human is when I was drinking, I was largely unconscious, and therefore I was in what I call part, or my ego. So all my friendships were made from part ego. So what I'm saying is my friends loved the ego part of Lee, and the ego part of Lee loved the friends. When I then developed a more self-consciousness, these people didn't recognize the real me, and I didn't recognize them or feel a deep connection to them. But that doesn't mean your life ends, because this new Lee has now met lots of other different people who are on my wavelength, who I can sit down on a couch and have a cuddle with, and for whom alcohol is either not in the picture or they're not alcohol reliant. So it's not a problem for me. Could you talk about that a little bit, about how going up a couple of levels in the video game of consciousness, how that impacts friendships? Because I want to give people hope here, Dylan, that when you make a monumental decision to stop drinking alcohol, it ain't the end of something; it's the beginning of something. Do you know what I mean?
I do. I'm gonna speak to the hope part second, but I'm gonna also speak to the fear part first, because it is incredibly vulnerable to work on yourself. Because what ends up happening, and this is something that my partner actually is currently experiencing in her life, you end up leveling up, and then you aren't able to be met by as many people. And that's really hard, right? It is so incredibly challenging and isolating, everything you just described, to put all of this work into yourself and then realize that the dating pool of friends becomes so much smaller because there aren't as many people who can have a shared empathetic experience for what you're going through, right? There's kind of there's like, this is a more of a woo framework that I use, but it's like, there's like, are you vibrating or are you resonating with humans, right? Resonance is like you grew up with them, they're your soul people, like you have shared experiences, you both love football, whatever. Like you have shared wants and ideas. But then your vibration is how much, like how strong are you vibrating in your space? Like, can they meet you in your current place in life with the work that you're doing or with the work that they're doing, right? And you usually need a lot of both. Like in the context you were describing, it's like there was a lot of resonance because y'all were just getting drunk all the time together. So you're really resonating on that. But there was no like you're all vibrating on a low level because you were in that space. And so that's why that was your peer group. That's why those are the humans that you spent time with. Whereas when you kind of start to up your self-love, growth, everything that you're talking about, it does become more isolating. And so for that, I want to speak to that first for the people going through it, because that's really important to acknowledge, is that it's not just that you do the work and then shit gets easier. In fact, you do the work and a lot of times things get harder on the front end very quickly, because you start to realize that all your social groups and everything, they aren't serving you. And then you have to rebuild your entire life around that. The payoff to that, though, is immense. Truly. It is living a life where you wake up every day and are genuinely grateful to have the day you're about to have is not something that can be bought. I promise you, I have friends that are very wealthy that don't have this experience. It's not something that can be bought. It is not something that can be given to you. It's something that you earn a lot of the time. And a lot of that earning of it is just being a human, right? Like there's this inherent gift that being a human being allows you to have, where like everyone deserves to have this sort of happiness in their life. So I'm not going to take away just like the inherent idea that human beings deserve to feel good in their days. And our current world is just not designed for that to be true for a lot of humans, given the societal pressures, economic pressures, and everything that's going down. And so when you do earn that space, when you feel comfortable in your routines, when your body feels healthy, when your work feels attuned to who you are as a person, when your friends allow you to be your most silly, weird, vibrant version of yourself, and then they're themselves in that, and then they also simultaneously will meet you intellectually and emotionally and hold space for you, and you'll hold space for them. That lifestyle is something that I'm so stupidly grateful to have in my current life, and is something that I do not take for granted, because not only did it take me working on myself, but it took a lot of social engineering to put myself in positions where I also met other humans that were doing that too. And I think that this is something that at my bachelor party we were just talking about. We did kind of like a bro circle about the things that we are grateful to ourselves the most for. It's like we all kind of went around talking about that. And the thing that I am grateful to myself the most for truly is how much time and energy I put into the people around me. Because what you're describing, like if you're putting time and energy into yourself, and then you're also putting that bandwidth into your community, the people around you, everyone will just raise up as like this. We are not individuals. We are these, monkey social creatures. And so we all have the capacity to kind of raise our collective well-being together. And it takes individuals who want to do that in order for that to be true. And so for those of you out here who maybe are listening and like, yo, I want to do all these things and I don't have like that social network. One, I'm so sorry. And two, please keep trying. Because there are humans out there that are trying. I think that human beings innately want to be happy and healthy. And we're getting dumped on by society right now in a lot of ways. So don't take that as a you problem in your soul. Take that as like a collective we problem as a species, and like work together to find your best way through it.
Yeah. And have some compassion and some patience, I guess. So like,
oh, wow.
when I was with my group, when I was a drinker, I don't even think I was conscious of the possibility of getting more friends. So here's a good example of like resonance and vibration, I guess. And it's the first time I've heard it like that. But when I sat down to interview you, before I sat down to interview you, I looked at an interview that you'd done with someone else so I could kind of gauge whether or not you had the mental capacity to have an interview. Because even though we're playing high stakes poker at like the highest fucking level for 7 figures plus, you wouldn't believe how many people find it really difficult to sit down and just have a simple conversation, right? So I watched you having an interview. I think it was a winner's interview, something very short. And I immediately felt a vibration. I immediately felt a connection to you. And then I invite you to come. You sit down. I immediately feel calm. I feel safe. I feel like I trust you. And then we start talking. And then within a couple of minutes, I'm like, I love this guy, right? Like I feel like a vibration. And then I come up to you and say, can you come on the podcast? Now, if we lived next to each other, I may, if I felt like it, say, hey, Dylan, do you want to hang out? Do you want to come for a cup of tea? You might say, no, we were talking about. I just don't have the capacity to have more friends right now. But that's an example of vibration. There's something that happens that I probably haven't thought about too much in the design versus default nature of friendships. Mm-hmm. So like I was definitely in default state, and now I'm in more of a design. Like I'm kind of like, if I want a friend, I'm going to make sure that they're a particular type of friend. But that alarm system that initially comes on that says, this is somebody, it's not like dating, right? It's like, yeah, this is somebody who you should be swiping right or left. I don't know how it goes, right? But it just kind of happens. It's pretty cool. Yeah.
No, I love that. It's really interesting making friends at this stage of my personal life because as I said, non-monogamy thing, also real. Have a partner who I'm getting married to, have at different times had partners as well. So like just having to navigate that is a whole spiel, like where you are having to separate your bandwidth into multiple humans. And the friendship aspect of it is unique in making new friends now too, because you really have to set healthy boundaries for yourself and then also not close yourself off as well. You have to really trust it. Like I said the words like your wise self. And this is one that is so hard. It's literally my biggest learning lesson currently. It's what I work on with my sports psychologist the most, is leaning and trusting the intuition into how another human makes you feel. My context for this is actually in poker because my mathematical game theory, pretty good. Like I'm pretty good at that stuff. Like that one was easier for me to learn. But the deep intuitive sense of feeling another person at a poker table and where they are, that is one that I'm learning I'm very good at, but I didn't put as much credence into on the front end. And I think what made me start to realize how good I was in the poker sense is that it's the same shit that you do with like people that you meet and people that you want to invest more into, right? And so I will not say yes to everyone who asks me to go on a podcast, but when I meet someone like you who I can feel is like trying to do the work and trying to help other people do the work, I'm always down to help people in that space because it is one, vulnerable to do your own work and to try to help other people, something I do myself as well. It's every time I show up to something like this, I don't get nervous, but I know that I want to put out good energy into the world. And I want to represent I want to be respectful and represent the space well. And you have to, on the other side of that, be like, all right, this is not the vibe. Like this is my boundary that I'm setting. I have people that will come up to me at the World Series, as I said, asking to be my friends. And a lot of them were like, yeah, let's be friends. But then maybe we can talk about poker. And I'm like, all right, bro, I'm not no offense, what am I receiving from this? Right? Like what am I going to get out of our interaction? And that might sound selfish. You need to be selfish as you start to kind of level up in the game because people want to feel resonant with somebody. They want to follow someone, right? That's why influencers are so big. When people are lost, they want to follow something. And when you become someone that people want to follow, they want things from you. And so you have to learn how to create the energetic boundaries for being able to help people as much as you have to offer without allowing that taking energy to overcome you too much, because that is what will happen. And I have a couple of friends in the poker world who are about as famous as they get that have had to scale back from being in the public space because there's so much taking that will come. But it makes sense. People, if they don't feel good in their days, they want to feel better. They see you as somebody who can help, right? That's why people watch podcasts like this. And that's a beautiful thing. And they should do that because they're trying to help themselves. You have to just remember that, you and I and everyone that are talking here are humans too.
Let's practice the boundary and the asking for something without having expectation. We're up to time. Yeah. I wondered if I could ask you one more question.
I'm here. Let's do it.
When you said that you're very good at a technical game and you're learning that you're also very good at the intuitive part, I wondered, did somebody make that wrong sometime in the past? Because I see that a lot in I see that in myself, my sensitivity, and I see it a lot in my clients. And I think it's a useful thing to hear your opinion on.
Yeah, no, that did happen. It's I was coached by a friend of mine. So pretty much I quit poker for a long time, worked in tech, worked on myself, was not a poker human, came back to poker about 6 years ago. My work outside of poker was in machine learning and data science. And so when I came back into poker and found out that all these tools existed to do, the mathy stuff, it's like, this is good. It was going to be good for me, right? My background was very solid on it. When I played poker as a child, a lot of it was like the very pattern recognition, human intuition. And I was really, really good as a kid at that stuff. But then when I came back into poker, my coach pretty much just told me that stuff wasn't good. It's like, you need to learn GTO. GTO is important. And it was the right lesson for me in that moment of time, because I needed to get really good at the game theory. You have absolutely no choice but to be an absolute beast at game theory if you want to succeed at the highest levels of this game. And so it was very good advice at the time. And it was bad advice. It was bad advice once I got very good at the game theory, because then I stopped doing the other thing that I'm also really good at. Right. And so it's kind of there's a really powerful approach to, this is actually an approach to trauma resolution, where you have a habit, or you have a pattern that you built in the past that was serving you, and an idea or a thought process that was serving you, but then it stopped serving you. Right. And I hit this point in my poker career. Like I did really well for like when I came back in, and then I hit this pretty intense downswing. I lost for about 1.5 years. In that time, I could just feel that like there was two parts of me that weren't talking to each other. And it was because I had this idea that this intuitive side of me was not correct. And I had to thank that idea, because it helped me for that period of time. It was so good for me for that first 1.5 years. And I had to let it go. Right. And that's a thing that I believe, I always misquote this one. It's either Perel or Bernet, where one of the most powerful ways to move on from a habit that is no longer serving you is to thank it for how it helped you. Like, thank you for getting me through this time. Thank you for turning me into this like GTO beast that you did. And now you're no longer serving me. And it takes and that you can't just do it once, right? There's this constant, like, because a lot of people get angry at their patterning, right? And this is one of those, like, thank you for being this way. I don't need you anymore. Every time it shows up. And now in like the work of my sports psychologist and in practice, I'm pretty resonant. Like I'm pretty stable in where I am. I think that's where my recent success, obviously there's variance, yada, 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 but a lot of it I think has come from this too. Right. And so the idea, like you asked a phenomenal question, because I had a very acute experience with this idea that I was doing a thing that was saying this other part of me wasn't correct. And just the acknowledgement and realization of that was such a big learning experience for me. So thank you for asking that question. It's a really good one.
Thank you for answering. I really appreciate it. Dylan, for people listening who would like to get some coaching from you, what's the best way for them to reach out and get in touch?
DylanWeisman.com. Easy peasy. And depending on what we want to work on, I'm always here to listen, have conversations, figure out if it would feel good for us to work together.
Awesome stuff. Dylan, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. I'd love to do another round 2 in the future. I'd love to talk more about ADHD. I'd love to talk more about polyamory. So much more we can go to. I understand now why Joe Rogan has 3-4 hour podcasts, although it doesn't fit into everybody's time. Thank you so much for being so present and grounded and giving so many gems. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, happy to be here. And great questions, honestly. This is a fantastic interview.
I hope you enjoyed that episode. Just a few thank yous. First of all, I want to thank you guys and girls for listening to this podcast and being supporters of it. Many people stop drinking alcohol just by listening to this podcast. I get a lot of people reaching out to me, thanking me for that, right? So give this to somebody as a gift today, or rate and review the podcast. If you can rate and review the podcast on your local podcast player and tell somebody about it, you could change somebody's life today, okay? So thank you for listening, and thank you in advance for that piece of service. Also want to thank our producer, Stan. Stan is still currently in the Ukraine, fighting the war, and producing our podcast while his family is somewhere else in the world right now, okay, apart from him. So everybody send out your prayers and your love. Stan, we love you. Thank you very much for everything you do here. For you out there, if you are starting to think about, contemplate, reflect on your relationship with alcohol, you do not have to do this alone. Yes, you drink alone, but you don't have to stop alone, okay? And if alcohol is not your thing, but you are starting to feel that you actually are living a parts-led life, the ego is getting in the way too much, so you're not happy with the way life is going, then reach out to us at thestrivemethod@gmail.com. Just say, Lee, and just tell me what is on your mind, and we'll start to have that conversation. Strive community is a beautiful place where you can start to feel seen, heard, and matter. It's where you can get community, and it's where you can start practicing what we call the 8 C's of self, our core values, right? Of creativity, curiosity, connection, compassion, courage. I can't remember the rest of them, but there's 8 of them, right? And we have our quest structured. So we have assignments, and they're really interesting, exciting. At the end of them, we say to you, come on, do this quest, right? Get involved in this challenge. And strivers are really finding it exciting, and they're working their challenges in these areas that are going to increase the amount of time they spend in self-energy, in a state of flow. And that has amazing repercussions for the relationship you grow with yourself, and for how you reach out to others in their life, like how you parent, how you are as a child to your, not child, but a son or a daughter, how you are in your relationship with the person you share your bed with, and how you behave with your employees, right? So reach out to me at strivemethod@gmail.com if you want to learn more. Okay, much love, everybody.